Case 1. Summer ManyWhiteHorses and James. Hymie ManyWhiteHorses, Cascade County, Montana, 2008. First-time authorities went looking for 2-year-old James Hymie. ManyWhiteHorses, they didn't expect anything alarming. He was supposed to be safe. He was supposed to be with family. He was supposed to be cared for. But every door they knocked on brought the same uneasy answer. He's not here. Try somewhere else. He's with the state. He's with relatives. Each explanation sounded practiced. None of them led to a child. Weeks passed, then months, and the longer people searched, the heavier the silence became. James was only 2 years old, too young to tell anyone where he hurt, too young to ask for help, too young to understand why no one had seen him since the spring. And when child welfare workers realized no one could name the last time they saw him, a cold fear settled in. Because when a toddler disappears without a sound, the questions start to feel like warnings. And everyone was left asking, how does a child this small vanish in plain sight without anyone noticing? James was born into a life harder than most. He was nonverbal on the autism spectrum and completely dependent on the adults around him. Relatives said he was gentle, a child who liked being held close, a child who reacted more to calm voices than anything else. He was the kind of little boy who needed extra patience, extra attention, and a home steady enough to give him predictability and warmth. But stability was something his mother, 31-year-old Summer Lee, ManyWhiteHorses, struggled to give. She had a history of violence, substance abuse, and periods of disappearing for days at a time. Relatives stepped in as often as they could. An aunt, a cousin, a grandparent, anyone who could offer the children a little peace. Even so, James ended up back in Summer's care that spring, despite concerns from people who had seen her spiral before. And in late May, everything stopped. According to Summer, on May the 28th, 2008, James fell from a high chair. She claimed he cried, then settled down. The next morning, she said he wasn't breathing. In that moment, she made the choice that would shape the entire case. Instead of calling for help, instead of rushing him to a hospital, she wrapped his tiny body in a blanket, opened the trunk of her car, and placed him inside. Fear of prison? That's what she later told detectives. Fear of being blamed. Fear of losing control again. But fear doesn't explain continuing to live her life as if nothing happened. Fear doesn't explain months of silence. For more than 3 months, Summer drove across Montana, Missoula, Browning, Great Falls, staying in hotels, visiting gas stations, and spending the disability benefits meant for James's care. 6 checks cashed. None of that money went to the little boy she claimed was fine. Her 11-year-old daughter traveled with her, unaware of the truth. Relatives kept asking about James. Summer's stories grew more unbelievable with each passing week. He's in Browning. He's in Portland. He's with the state. No one knew that the trunk of her car held the answer she was running from. On July 21st, 2008, Summer crashed her car in Great Falls and was arrested for DUI. Her daughter was placed in protective care. James was nowhere to be found. Still, she insisted he was in foster care, or with relatives, or in state custody, but child welfare had no record of him. By early September, every explanation she offered had collapsed in on itself. A formal missing person investigation was opened on September 4th, and detectives brought Summer back in for questioning. This time, the weight of her own silence became too much. On September 5th, She told them where to look. Officers walked through a Great Falls tow yard toward her impounded vehicle, the same car she crashed in July. They opened the trunk. Inside was the small, wrapped body of 2-year-old James, lying exactly where she had left him months before. Even seasoned detectives stood in quiet disbelief. Cascade County Attorney John Parker later called it one of the most disturbing cases the county had seen, not because of graphic violence, but because it was a tragedy carried in silence for so long. An autopsy couldn't determine the exact cause of death due to decomposition, but medical findings and witness testimony revealed something heartbreaking. James had been hurt many times before that final day. Prosecutors estimated more than 100 injuries in his short life. Facing overwhelming evidence, Summer pleaded guilty on June 12, 2009 to negligent homicide and tampering with physical evidence. She cried on the witness stand as she described failing to seek help and hiding the body. Families filled the courtroom, grieving not only the child they lost, but the years of red flags they believed had been ignored. Aunt Ernestine Small, who had often cared for the children, said the system should never have placed James back with Summer. Cousin Jermaine Gopher said quietly, "Only Summer and God know what happened." Prosecutors asked for 100 years. The defense argued for far less, emphasizing the plea to negligence. Judge Julie Maquette listened to every word, then sentenced Summer to 40 years in the Montana Women's Prison, plus time for tampering. Later, federal charges for benefit misuse added 2 more years. James's death shook Great Falls and the Blackfeet community. It raised painful questions about child placement, oversight, and what happens when warning signs go unanswered. His name is still honored during the Disability Day of Mourning, where victims of neglect are remembered with prayer and quiet reflection. His family continues to grieve a little boy whose life was far too short, far too hidden, and far too quiet. James Hymie, ManyWhiteHorses, was 2 years old, a child who couldn't speak for himself, a child who depended entirely on the adults around him. Tonight we say his name because he mattered, and because his story asks the question that begins this entire documentary. When a child has no voice, who will speak for them? Case 2. Mary Agnes Leider and Tennielle Big Day. Crow Indian Reservation, Montana, 2012. The last evening of Tennielle Big Day's life didn't feel unusual to anyone who saw her. She was only 3, tiny, lively, and full of the kind of curiosity children carry naturally. Her father had described her as a Lego-loving baby, the kind who danced proudly during traditional Crow gatherings. In a community where children represent the future, little Tennielle was deeply cherished. Her mother, Mary Agnes Leider, was 25. She grew up on the Crow Reservation, surrounded by extended relatives and the cultural traditions that define life there. But Mary had been fighting a long, quiet battle with alcohol. It followed her into adulthood, into her relationships, and into the choices she made. And on December 2nd, 2012, that struggle would lead to a tragedy the reservation still talks about today. For much of Tennielle's life, she was raised by her paternal grandparents. They adored her and looked after her often, giving her stability and care. Mary visited and remained part of her daughter's life, but drinking had always been a problem. That night, after several hours of drinking with her brothers, Mary brought Tennielle along, despite her own mother calling and texting repeatedly, begging her to return the child home. In the early morning hours of December 3rd, The group ended up on Highway 313, a long, dark stretch of road running south of Hardin. Wally, Mary's brother, drove her pickup. Another brother, A.L., sat nearby. Tennielle was with her mother, a vulnerable child surrounded by adults consumed by alcohol and poor judgment. What happened next was pieced together through interviews, Mary's own shifting statements, and the blunt truth from Wally. While the pickup was moving along Highway 313, Mary opened the passenger door. Tennielle was right beside her. With no warning, Mary pushed or threw the child out onto the cold pavement. Wally slammed on the brakes, ran back, and found the toddler lying motionless on the highway. He lifted her gently and carried her back to the truck. Her small body didn't respond. Inside the cab, there was panic. Not clear-headed concern, but drunken confusion. Instead of calling for help, Wally drove onward. At one point, he stopped near mile marker 11 and left Mary and A.L. on the roadside, both of them distraught. He then continued driving with Tennielle's body toward their family home. Around 4:06 a.m., a 911 call came in. 2 people were crying on the roadside, disoriented and desperate. Deputies arrived and found Mary and A.L., both emotional and incoherent. Mary insisted that her daughter had been struck by a passing car. Not long after, another call came from mile marker 19. A child had been found dead in a pickup truck. Relatives later told investigators that when Mary's mother located the truck, she saw her granddaughter's small body in the back seat. There was blood on the child's head. The grandmother begged for an ambulance. Even in that moment, she tried to believe there was still hope. But it was too late. At Hardin Memorial Hospital, Mary's blood alcohol concentration was measured at 0.24%, 3 times the legal limit. She had cuts and abrasions from the night, but nothing compared to what officers found when they examined Tennielle. Initially, Mary said her daughter had been hit by a vehicle. Later, she said it was a crash. Then, in another breath, she muttered words that cut through the confusion. "I killed my baby." Her brothers gave the clearest account. Wally explained exactly what he'd seen. Mary opening the door and throwing Tennielle from the moving truck. A.L. confirmed the same timeline. The autopsy left no question. The child died from severe blunt head injuries consistent with being thrown from a vehicle onto the highway. This was not an accident. This was homicide. News traveled quickly across the reservation. Losing a child is painful enough, but losing one in this way struck the community at its core. Tribal leaders had long spoken about alcohol's impact on families. Many saw this as another reminder of how far-reaching the problem had become. Tennielle's father and uncle spoke openly during the hearings. Her uncle described her as a bright part of the tribe's future, a child whose presence strengthened the family. The grief in his voice reflected the grief felt across the community. Mary was charged in federal court because the crime occurred on reservation land. She pleaded guilty to second-degree murder on July 24, 2013. In October of that year, she stood in front of U.S. District Judge Donald Malloy for sentencing. Her family filled the courtroom. So did members of the Big Day family. Mary cried as she addressed the court. Her words were broken and brief. Words can't explain anything. The judge listened, then spoke firmly but with understanding. He acknowledged her addiction and her remorse, but he also acknowledged the truth. A child had lost her life because of choices made under the influence. He urged the community to confront the alcohol crisis hurting so many families. Mary was sentenced to 262 months in federal prison, nearly 22 years, followed by 5 years of supervised release. Under federal law, there is no parole. She will serve almost the entire sentence. In the days after Tennielle's funeral, her family stayed close. Her grandparents kept her memory alive with stories of her little dances, her toys, and the bright future she never got to grow into. Her death became a painful symbol of how quickly addiction can tear apart a family, even a loving one. Her father said he would never forget her smile. Her uncle said the loss would echo across the tribe for years. And across the reservation, many people prayed, not just for justice, but for healing, strength, and change. Tonight we remember Tennielle, a child who deserved far more time, far more love, and a far gentler world. Case 3, Amanda Rose, Steffen and baby Rosanna Fox, Yellowstone County, Montana, 2012. There are moments in life when silence feels heavier than any sound. In early June of 2012, inside a small apartment on Avenue B in Billings, that kind of silence settled over a young couple who had no idea how to face what had happened. A 19-year-old mother sat on the floor staring at a child who could no longer respond. Her partner moved back and forth through the apartment, unsure of what to do, unsure of what to say. The walls around them had heard months of crying, struggling, and chaos. But now, for the first time, everything was still. A 3-month-old baby named Rosanna lay in her car seat, quiet in a way no infant should ever be. That moment became the beginning of a heartbreaking truth, a truth hidden for nearly 2 years before it finally came to light. Rosanna Fox entered the world in March 2012. She was a newborn who hadn't yet grown into her features. A little girl whose life should have been filled with soft blankets, warm hands, and steady care. But from the start, her home life was fragile. Her mother, Amanda Rose Steffen, was barely out of high school. She carried untreated mental illnesses that would later be described as severe and long-standing. Those illnesses shaped her moods, her thinking, and the way she reacted to stress. Her partner, 32-year-old Jeff Fox, had a criminal record and struggled himself. Together, they lived in a small apartment where pressure grew quietly behind closed doors. Family members weren't always around to see the warning signs. Neighbors heard arguments sometimes. They heard crying. But as it often happens in apartment complexes, people assumed the parents were simply overwhelmed, never imagining the depth of what was happening inside. What investigators would learn years later was that the abuse began when Rosanna was only 2 weeks old. Amanda's confession, given in 2014, revealed a pattern that lasted nearly Rosanna's entire life. She admitted slapping the baby, shaking her, and pressing down on her tiny tongue to quiet her. She admitted keeping her strapped in a car seat for hours, placing the seat in a closet, and leaving her there alone. The more stressed Amanda became, the more dangerous her behavior grew. Jeff Fox witnessed many of these moments. He later said he didn't step in, even when he knew the baby was being hurt. On June 4, 2012, the final act took place. Amanda had been agitated. She and Jeff both admitted to smoking marijuana. Rosanna cried, softly, confused, longing for comfort. Amanda hit her in the forehead with enough force to cause a skull injury. Instead of calling for help, she placed Rosanna in the car seat again. This time, she set the seat in the closet, shut the door, and walked away. She eventually passed out, leaving her child alone for hours. When she woke up and realized the baby wasn't breathing, panic finally set in. Only then did they call 911. Rosanna was rushed to Billings Clinic. Doctors and nurses tried to revive her, but it became clear quickly that her injuries were not only fresh, they were layered. The medical team found old bruises, healing injuries, and signs of long-term neglect. They saw dehydration, fractures, and marks that told a painful story of repeated harm. Even with their best efforts, Rosanna could not be saved. But without a confession or witness willing to speak honestly, the case stalled. For almost 2 years, authorities knew the child had been harmed, but they did not have enough to prove how or why. Then everything changed. On April 18, 2014 in California, Amanda walked into the Sonoma County Sheriff's Office on her own. She stood there in front of officers who had never met her before and said she needed to tell the truth about what happened to her daughter. She described the months of abuse in detail. She talked about slapping Rosanna, shaking her, covering her mouth, and confining her. She spoke about the day Rosanna died, the blow to the forehead, and the hours she left her child alone afterward. Her confession stunned the detectives. She was immediately detained and Montana authorities were contacted. Within days, she was extradited back to Billings. Once Amanda spoke, the pieces came together. Billings detectives reviewed old reports, autopsy documents, and forgotten witness accounts. They found the truth in the details Amanda shared, details no one else could have known, unless they had been in the room when it happened. Jeff Fox was questioned again. This time, his involvement became clear. He hadn't caused the fatal injury, but he hadn't protected the child either. His failure to act became part of the case. The years of silence around Rosanna's death finally broke open. Facing the evidence, Amanda pleaded guilty in January 2015 to negligent homicide, aggravated assault, and assault on a minor. A full psychiatric evaluation confirmed several serious mental illnesses, all untreated at the time of Rosanna's death. She was legally found guilty but mentally ill. On March 16, 2016, Judge Mary Jane Nicely ordered Amanda to the Montana State Hospital for a 40-year commitment, with the possibility of transfer to prison if her mental health stabilized. She would not be eligible for parole for at least a decade. Jeff Fox pleaded guilty later that year to negligent homicide. He was sentenced to 20 years, with 10 suspended, as a persistent felony offender. During sentencing, the prosecutor spoke with quiet sorrow about a baby who knew nothing but suffering. She said Rosanna suffered her entire life. And the words struck everyone in the courtroom. Even Judge Nicely, known for her steady tone, described the case as torture, though she acknowledged that mental illness played a large part in Amanda's actions. Rosanna's story is one of the most painful tragedies in Billings' recent history, not only because of the harm she endured, but because the truth remained buried for nearly 2 years. The people who first tried to save her carried the memory of her tiny, injured body long after they went home from their shifts. For many who learned about the case, the grief came from imagining the life she could have had, a life filled with gentle care instead of fear. Rosanna is remembered today through the voices of those who fought for justice on her behalf. Her case is taught quietly in child welfare circles, reminding professionals how easily suffering can be hidden. And for viewers hearing her story now, she becomes more than a case file. She becomes a reminder of how important it is to notice when a child's cries go unanswered. Tonight we say her name with respect. Baby Rosanna, loved too late, remembered always. Case 4. Ashley Maria Howard and 2-year-old Caleb Hopkins, Glendive, Montana, 2018. Some stories begin quietly on nights when a town settles into calm and no one senses what's coming. June 25, 2018, was one of those nights in Glendive. Porch lights glowed across the neighborhood. A warm breeze moved down the streets. And inside a parked vehicle near a small house filled with loud voices and music, a little boy slept alone. His name was Caleb Hopkins, just 2 years old. His mother, 19-year-old Ashley Howard, had been upset after an argument with her boyfriend. Instead of staying home or asking her family for help they had offered many times, she drove to a friend's house where a party was going on. People there said she walked in without a child. She drank. She laughed. Hours passed, and outside, Caleb remained in the car through the night. He had been seen healthy and happy earlier that day at daycare, smiling, playing, full of energy. He was a bright little boy who depended entirely on the adults in his life. But as the hours went by, the inside of the vehicle grew hotter. Morning turned into afternoon. No one checked on him. Not even once. Ashley didn't return to her vehicle until nearly 1 p.m. the next afternoon. By then, almost 14 hours had gone by. When she opened the door, she found Caleb still wrapped in his blanket, completely unresponsive. Fear hit her instantly. She tried cooling him in a bathtub, then called the hospital, rushing him to Glendive Medical Center. Doctors worked on him right away. His temperature had reached 107 degrees. He was airlifted to Billings for advanced care. 2 days later, after every effort had been made, little Caleb passed away. Deputies began asking questions, and the truth came out in pieces. Ashley's stories didn't match. First, she said he had been indoors. Then she blamed the daycare. But witnesses said she arrived at the party alone. Her phone messages showed she planned to stay out all night, ignoring calls and concerns. Her own father told investigators this wasn't the first time she had left Caleb in a hot car. He remembered 3 moments when he feared something terrible might happen. He begged her to slow down, to accept help, to think about her son. But she didn't. Those warnings, combined with medical findings and witness accounts, led to Ashley's arrest on August the 13th, 2018. The case drew so much attention in Glendive that the trial was moved to Great Falls. Jurors listened to doctors, deputies, daycare workers, and relatives who loved Caleb deeply. Each person spoke with steady sadness about the signs that had been missed and the moments that could have changed the outcome. Caleb's grandmother gave an emotional statement. She talked about the support the family offered Ashley, the chances she had to ask for help, and how many times they tried to protect the little boy. Her voice carried through the courtroom when she said there were so many ways this could have been prevented. In September 2020, the jury found Ashley guilty of negligent homicide. On October 19, 2020, Ashley stood before Judge Elizabeth Best. She cried as she spoke, saying she missed her son, but she still struggled to fully accept responsibility. Judge Best sentenced her to 20 years, 5 suspended, 15 to serve, no parole for the first 10, mandatory mental health treatment and credit for the time she had already spent in custody. Caleb's death changed more than a family. It shook a community. People in Glendive asked how a child could be lost like this when there were so many hands willing to help. His story became a quiet call for parents to reach out when they're overwhelmed, and for families to keep speaking up when something feels wrong. Caleb should have grown far beyond those 2 short years. He should have had birthdays, first days of school, summers running through the grass. Instead, he lives on in the memories of those who knew him as a joyful, gentle child with a bright smile. Tonight we speak his name with respect and love. Caleb Hopkins, 2 years old, remembered always. Case 5. Whisper Rayne Hawkbear and baby Ezekiel, Great Falls, Montana, 2023. Some tragedies begin with a single moment when someone reaches out for help, hoping things will calm down. In the early hours of April 21st, 2023, a short call came into the Great Falls 911 center. The voice on the other end sounded young, tired, and overwhelmed. She said her children had been crying for hours. She didn't know what to do. Then she changed her mind and hung up. Inside a small apartment at Rockcrest Commons, 20-year-old Whisper Rayne Hawkbear was alone with her 2 children, a 2-month-old baby boy named Ezekiel and his 16-month-old sister. It was quiet outside, but inside the home their cries echoed through the rooms. Whisper paced from one end of the apartment to the other, exhausted and unsure how to calm them. 2 days earlier, the children's father had called authorities from out of state, worried about how she was coping. He hoped someone would check on the kids. No one realized how close they were to a moment that would change everything. The hours after that first call were a blur. Witnesses didn't hear sounds from the apartment, but Whisper later told investigators she was desperate for sleep. The cries of the children didn't stop. She felt trapped and overwhelmed, raising 2 small kids alone in a home where she had no steady support and no one to step in when parenting became too much. Between 3 a.m. and 4 a.m., everything broke down. Whisper began losing control. Her frustration turned into actions she could never take back. At 4:15 a.m., Whisper called 911 again. This time her voice was flat and distant, as if she already knew what officers would find when they arrived. She asked for help, adding a sentence the dispatcher would never forget. "I think I killed my kids." Officers raced to Rockcrest Commons. When they reached the door, Whisper hesitated, then let them inside. She placed baby Ezekiel into an officer's arms. He was limp, covered in blood, and showing no signs of life. In the bedroom, they heard the toddler crying. Her small face injured, her little nose damaged so badly that doctors later said she would have permanent scars. Both children were rushed to the hospital. Doctors fought for Ezekiel, but his injuries were too severe. He was pronounced dead at 5:17 a.m. He had lived only 2 months. Investigators arrived soon after. They documented blood on the carpet, stains on the bedding, and a mirror shattered across the floor. The marks on the walls showed where the toddler had been hurt. The damage around the room matched the violence Whisper later described. She admitted that she threw Ezekiel against a wall. She admitted to hitting him with part of a playpen. She admitted to stepping on his head. She also admitted to slamming her toddler into a mirror and against the wall more than once. The little girl survived, but her injuries would shape the rest of her life. Detectives didn't need long to understand what had happened. Whisper described it herself in detail during her interview later that morning. She said she was tired. She said she just wanted the crying to stop. When officers asked if she knew her actions caused Ezekiel's death, she answered quietly, "Yes." They arrested her the same day. She was charged on April 24, 2023, and held on a $500,000 bond. As more details came out, the community learned that 2 days before the tragedy, the father had begged authorities to check on the children. That welfare check did not happen in time. The community grieved not only the loss of Ezekiel, but the painful thought that someone had tried to prevent it and wasn't heard in time. For nearly 2 years, the case worked its way through the legal system. Whisper's attorney acknowledged what happened, but said she had lost control in a moment of exhaustion and anger. The county attorney argued that the violence was too severe, too deliberate, and too heartbreaking to overlook. On March 7, 2025, Whisper pleaded guilty to deliberate homicide. The assault charge involving the toddler was dismissed in exchange for the plea, but the court was fully aware of the harm done. On June 23, 2025, she stood before the judge for sentencing. There were few words spoken, no loud statements, just a quiet courtroom filled with sadness for 2 children who had no way to defend themselves. Whisper received 100 years in the Montana Women's Prison with no time suspended, one of the longest child homicide sentences in Cascade County in recent years. The news spread quickly across Great Falls. Parents held their children a little closer. Many stopped by vigils held for Ezekiel, small gatherings with candles, toys, and prayers for a life that ended too soon. Friends, neighbors, and strangers donated to cover his funeral. People spoke softly about the toddler who survived, a child who would carry the scars of that night both physically and emotionally. And everywhere in the community, the same question lingered. Could this have been prevented if someone had checked on them when the father asked? Ezekiel lived for only 2 months, but he touched countless hearts. His story reminded people how fragile a child's safety can be when a parent feels alone and overwhelmed. It reminded the community that a single welfare check, a single visit, a single moment of intervention can change everything. He didn't live long enough to smile, to laugh, or to see the world outside that small apartment. But he is remembered by the officers who carried him, by the doctors who tried to save him, by the people who lit candles in his honor. Tonight we say his name with compassion. Ezekiel Contreras, remembered, mourned, and held in prayer. Case 6, Janelle Red Dog and 13-month-old Kenzley Olson. Poplar, Montana, 2016. In a small community like Poplar, mornings usually begin quietly, the sound of coffee brewing, the hum of trucks warming up, families stepping into a new day. But on April 19, 2016, the Fort Peck Reservation woke to an alert no one ever expects to hear. A toddler was missing. Her name was Kenzley Olson, only 13 months old. The kind of child who should have been learning to walk, laughing in someone's arms, safely tucked into a warm home. Instead, before sunrise, her disappearance triggered an Amber Alert that rippled across Montana and into North Dakota. The person who reported her missing was 42-year-old Janelle Red Dog, her aunt, the woman who had been caring for Kenzley while the baby's mother was in jail. Janelle told tribal officers that she'd gone to the bathroom, and when she returned, the child was gone. Her story sounded urgent. Her fear seemed real. And for a brief moment, the community believed they were searching for a stranger who had taken a little girl in the night. But the truth was far more painful. Inside Janelle's home, the night had not been peaceful. Kenzley had been crying. She was fussy, restless, and wanted comfort. Investigators later learned the truth through Janelle's own words. She struck the child twice in the head to make the crying stop. The blows were so strong that the little girl became unresponsive almost immediately. Instead of calling for help, Janelle panicked. She used meth in the hours after the assault. She watched the toddler's small body grow still, and she did nothing to save her. By dawn, the fear of facing what she'd done pushed Janelle into a desperate lie. She placed Kenzley into a blue duffel bag, walked several blocks, and left the bag inside a dumpster in an alleyway. Then she went home and slept. When she woke up, she called tribal law enforcement and reported the little girl missing. That call sparked an entire region into action. Officers searched houses, alleys, streets, open lots. Families stayed inside out of fear. People wondered who would take a child from her own home. For nearly 24 hours, the community lived in fear of an abductor who never existed. During questioning, investigators noticed problems in Janelle's story. Details that didn't line up. Timelines that didn't match. Explanations that seemed rehearsed. Tribal officers stayed with her for hours, asking questions gently, trying to find the truth beneath the confusion. Finally, on April 20th, Janelle broke down. She admitted everything. She told them where they would find the body. She drew a map showing the dumpster behind the row of poplar houses. Officers moved quickly. The blue duffel bag was exactly where she said it would be. Inside was baby Kenzley. The news spread through Poplar faster than anyone expected. People cried in the streets. Flowers and stuffed animals appeared outside the home where Kenzley once lived. A small community that had already endured hardships faced another loss. Another child taken by violence, tied to meth and neglect. Her autopsy revealed something even harder to bear. Kenzley had more than fresh injuries. She had older bruises, too, signs she had been hurt before. It was a truth the community feared but could no longer ignore. Because the crime took place on tribal land, federal authorities took over. Janelle was charged first in tribal court, then indicted in federal court months later on charges including first-degree murder, second-degree murder, child abuse, and accessory after the fact. She eventually pleaded guilty to second-degree murder on May 1st, 2017, avoiding a trial that the family could not bear to sit through. On July 26, 2017, she was sentenced in federal court. 20 years in federal prison, 3 years supervised release. Judge Brian Morris spoke gently but firmly, acknowledging a community already hurting from ongoing violence and drug problems. He said the case was horrific, not only because of what happened to Kenzley, but because it reflected deeper wounds across the reservation. Kenzley's funeral took place at the Brockton Cultural Center. People filled the room with tears, prayers, and songs. Her short life stirred a movement, calls for better child protection, more addiction resources, and stronger support for families trying to raise children in difficult circumstances. Her grandmother, Rhea Starr, defended Janelle at first, saying she stepped in when no one else did. But as more details surfaced, the family's grief deepened. They mourned a baby who should have been safe, and they grieved the broken systems around them. Candles, ribbons, and teddy bears lined the streets for weeks after her death. Her name became part of larger discussions about Native child safety and the crushing impact of meth on families. 13-month-old Kenzley Olson had barely begun her life. She should have spent that spring learning to walk, babbling new words, reaching for her mother when she came home. Instead, she became the face of a tragedy that shook the Fort Peck Reservation and broke the hearts of everyone who searched for her. Her story is one of the most painful reminders that sometimes the danger comes from within the very homes meant to protect a child, and yet her memory has become a call to speak up sooner, to support overwhelmed caregivers, and to make sure no other child falls through the cracks. Tonight we honor her life. Kenzley Olson, a child who deserved safety, love, and a life far longer than the one she was given. Case 7. Leannah Jean Gardipe, Evelyn and Namaus, Missoula, Montana, 2021. Some stories reach a point where you stop and wonder how a mother's mind could drift so far from the children who trusted her most. On the morning of November 19th, 2021, a quiet neighborhood on Patty Ann Drive was shaken awake when a grandmother made a frantic call to 911. Her daughter, 34-year-old Leannah Jean Gardipe, had told her she saved her babies. But the tone in her voice said something very different. Within minutes, another call came in, this time from Leannah herself. She said there had been a murder in her home. She said her children needed help. The dispatcher sent deputies immediately, praying the two little ones inside that apartment were somehow still alive. Inside that home were 5-year-old Namaus and 3-year-old Evelyn, tiny siblings whose world should have been nothing but crayons, storybooks, and warm blankets. Their father, Travis Sandberg, had spent months telling anyone who would listen that he feared for their safety. But custody had shifted earlier that year, placing the children back in the care of their mother. Family members later described Evelyn as gentle, always holding on to someone's shirt or sleeve for comfort. Namaus was more adventurous, curious about everything, always asking questions. They were the kind of children who change a room just by walking into it. They were asleep when the violence began. Deputies stepped into Leannah's apartment and found a scene no one could ever prepare for. Both children lay on a bed, fully dressed, still and silent. A knife was discovered under the bed, stained, and next to it a handwritten note left by Leannah herself. The note read, "It was the only way that we all wouldn't burn. Now I'm the only one of us that will." It was an explanation wrapped in confusion, a reflection of a mind slipping into fear that had no place in reality. Investigators believed the children were attacked while sleeping. There were no signs of a struggle. No signs they even had the chance to wake up. What the public learned later was that Leannah had struggled for years. A breakdown the year before led to an ER visit and a 3-week stay at a treatment center. She was in counseling, trying to stay steady. But those closest to her said she had days where she spoke in ways that frightened them. Days where she believed danger was closing in, even when the world around her was calm. Her ex-husband warned authorities more than once. He said the children were at risk. He begged people to listen. But the system placed the children back with their mother in May 2021. On the morning of the murders, Leannah told deputies she believed she was saving them from something only she could see. Mental health professionals later confirmed she was deeply ill during those moments, unable to see what was real and what wasn't. Missoula County deputies gathered evidence, took photographs of the note, and secured the knife. Leannah was arrested at the scene. She never tried to run. She seemed lost, disconnected, speaking in short, scattered statements. Her mother's voice, captured in the emergency call, told officers everything they needed to know. There had been no kidnapping, no intruder. Only a mother trapped in her own mind and two children who never stood a chance. Autopsy findings confirmed what deputies feared. Multiple stab wounds, including injuries to their necks. For many in Missoula, it was the hardest news they had ever heard. In the months that followed, the courtroom filled with grief. Two families sat on opposite sides, linked forever by a tragedy they would never understand. Leannah first entered a not guilty plea. But after evaluations and months of testimony, she changed her plea on August 29, 2023, admitting what she had done. At sentencing, her ex-husband Travis spoke through tears. "I pleaded over and over that my children were in danger." The judge listened closely. He acknowledged Leannah's mental illness, but he also repeated what every parent in the room already understood. Two small children were gone, and nothing would ever make sense of it. On November 20th, 2023, Leannah received 2 life sentences to be served in the custody of Montana's Department of Public Health and Human Services, where she will remain under psychiatric treatment for the rest of her life. Missoula carried the loss like a shadow for months. Neighbors left flowers and teddy bears outside the apartment. Churches held vigils. People cried for Evelyn and Namaus, 2 children who should have had countless birthdays, countless mornings waking up to cartoons, countless chances to grow. Families across Montana began asking harder questions about mental health, custody decisions, and how to protect children caught in the middle of adult struggles. Their memorial service that winter was soft and quiet. Photos of 2 smiling siblings, a room full of people holding on to one another, and a pastor who asked the question everyone had been thinking: how do we move forward when the hurt runs this deep? Evelyn and Namaus should still be here. They should have been running through the yard, making crafts at preschool, learning to ride bikes in the summer sun. Instead, their story is now a reminder, one that sits heavy in the heart, that mental illness can turn into danger when systems fail, when warnings go unanswered, and when a mother who needed help was left to fight her battles alone. Tonight, we speak their names with love. Evelyn Sandberg, Namaus Sandberg. 2 little lives that deserved safety, comfort, and a future far brighter than the ending they were given. Case 8, Patricia Batts and 12-year-old Alex Hurley, West Yellowstone, Montana, 2020. Winter mornings in West Yellowstone have a way of slowing everything down. The snow rests heavy on rooftops, smoke rises from chimneys, and most families stay wrapped in warmth until the sun finally breaks through the cold. But on February 3rd, 2020, the stillness was interrupted by a call that didn't match the quiet outside. A boy had stopped breathing. 12-year-old Alex Hurley, a child who should have been getting ready for school, tying his shoes, maybe asking for breakfast, lay on the living room floor while adults tried to explain what happened. His grandmother, Patricia Batts, told responders he simply collapsed. Nothing more, nothing unusual. The first officers wanted to believe her, but the moment they stepped inside, something in the air shifted. A quiet heaviness that told them there was far more to this story. Before he became the face of a statewide tragedy, Alex was just a kid trying to find his way. He'd moved to Montana after losing his father in an accident. His family hoped this change would give him a new start, a home where he could heal, grow, and be surrounded by people who cared. His biological mother described him as gentle, patient, and always eager to help. He loved being outside. He loved making people laugh. Nothing about him ever suggested the storm he was facing behind closed doors. For a child who had already endured the loss of a parent, he was trying his best to stay hopeful. Detectives later learned that Alex's death didn't come out of nowhere. The suffering had begun months earlier, in December 2019, inside the Batts family home on Buffalo Drive. On Patricia's phone were dozens of videos, short, painful moments captured by members of the home. None of them were ever meant to be seen by outsiders. The clips showed punishments that never should have existed. Forced physical drills until he collapsed. Cold water poured over him. Long hours without food. Days where rest was treated like a privilege. The most heartbreaking part wasn't only what Alex endured. It was how quietly he endured it. Neighbors didn't hear anything. The town didn't know. And with West Yellowstone being so rural, far from social workers or regular school oversight, his suffering remained hidden. On February 3rd, Patricia said Alex suddenly fell to the floor. But as officers examined him, their concern grew. The bruises were too severe, the injuries too consistent with long-term abuse. An autopsy confirmed what they feared. Alex had been struck in the back of the head with a wooden paddle. A blow delivered by Patricia's teenage son, acting under her direction. But that wasn't the only injury. His body showed months of harm, unhealed bruises, marks, and signs of deprivation. This wasn't one moment, it was many. When deputies seized the family's phones and began watching the videos, everything became clear. There were more than 70 recordings, each time-stamped, showing the same pattern of punishment and intimidation. Detective Sergeant Bjorn Boyer described the case as one of the hardest he had ever worked on. It was systematic, planned, and carried out in a home that should have been this boy's safe place. A welfare check from the school had been triggered months earlier, after Alex stopped attending classes in September 2019. But no follow-up home visit came. The isolation of the home allowed the abuse to grow until it was too late. Within a week, 3 people in the household were in custody: Patricia, her husband, James Sasser Jr., and their teenage son. The legal process unfolded slowly. COVID delays and evaluations stretched the timeline across several years. Patricia initially faced the possibility of the death penalty, a rare step in Montana. But in early 2023, prosecutors withdrew that option, aiming instead for a sentence that would ensure she never harmed another child again. On May 26, 2023, Patricia stood in court and pleaded guilty to deliberate homicide, criminal child endangerment, tampering with witnesses. The courtroom filled with quiet sobs as the facts of the case were read aloud. Her final sentencing took place on August 22, 2023. Alex's mother, Alicia Davis, spoke through tears. "I just hope she gets what she gets." Family members wore shirts with Alex's face on them, reminders of the boy they lost and the childhood he never had the chance to finish. Judge John Brown looked at Patricia for a long moment before delivering his decision. He said the actions on those videos were among the most horrific he had ever seen. He said Alex deserved protection, comfort, and love, the things every child should have. Then he sentenced her to life imprisonment without parole. West Yellowstone is small. Everyone knows everyone. A loss like this leaves a mark on every street, every family, every classroom. A vigil was held on February 23, 2020 at Pioneer Park. Nearly 200 people stood in the cold night air holding candles and praying for a boy many of them never met, because sometimes the smallest towns have the biggest hearts. His story sparked statewide training for teachers, officers, and medical staff. It pushed conversations about child safety into living rooms and county offices across Montana. Alex was gone, but he left behind a call to action. Alex Hurley should still be alive. He should have grown out of his awkward middle school years, learned to drive, and found joy again after losing his father. Instead, we speak his name with a quiet reverence, not to dwell on the darkness, but to honor the light he carried. Alex deserved a family that lifted him up. He deserved warmth, safety, and a home filled with love. Tonight, his memory becomes a reminder for all of us to look closer, listen deeper, and never assume that silence means safety. We remember him with love. James Alexander, Alex Hurley, a child who should have been allowed to grow. When you look back at every story in this documentary, one truth rises above all the others. Evil doesn't always come from strangers. Sometimes it walks in through the front door. Sometimes it sits at the table. Sometimes it tucks a child in at night. And that is what makes these cases so heavy. 8 children, 8 families, 8 stories where the people meant to care for them were the ones who brought the most harm. But even in the middle of that darkness, something else was there too. The light of small towns who mourned together, detectives who refused to give up, teachers who spoke up when something felt wrong, and communities who turned grief into action. Across Montana, from Missoula to Great Falls, from Poplar to West Yellowstone, people gathered to hold candles, pray, and honor the lives that should have been longer. Some stood silently, some cried, some whispered the names of children they never knew, just so those names would not fade. Because when a child's life ends too soon, the whole world feels it. And when a community chooses to remember, the child is never truly gone. If you are watching this and you've carried your own scars, if you've lost someone or lived through a home that didn't feel safe, you are not alone. There are people who will listen. There are people who will help. There are people who still believe in protecting the innocent, even when the world feels heavy. And for the families still grieving, for the brothers, sisters, parents, and grandparents who wake up every day wishing things were different, our hearts are with you. We speak these children's names because they mattered. Because their stories remind us to pay attention, to ask questions, to check in on the quiet homes, the tired parents, the kids who stop showing up to school, the neighbors who pull away. Sometimes one call, one visit, one conversation is all it takes to save a life. Evil tries to hide in silence, but compassion speaks louder. Truth speaks louder. Faith speaks louder. So tonight, as we close this journey through Montana's hardest stories, hold on to the hope that good people still outnumber the bad. Hold on to the belief that healing is possible, even after heartbreak. And hold on to the memory of the children whose stories you've heard, not because of how they died, but because of how deeply they were loved. Thank you for listening. Thank you for caring. And may every child who suffers in silence find someone brave enough to speak for them,